Good morning, Diane.
Good morning.
All right, everybody, thank you for those moments. Before we hit the gavel and officially call things to order, I'll make sure that we have Trustee Dr. Diane Nicolette on the line. I see her there. Just want to make sure to hear.
I am here.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Nicolette. Okay, folks, with this banner crowd. Okay, it is 10:06 a.m., and I will call to order this work session meeting of the Washoe County School District Board of Trustees. It is Tuesday, February 11th, 2025, and we'll call this meeting to order. And now I would like to ask for roll call from Clerk Woodley.
Thank you, Madam President. Trustee Christine Hall.
Present.
Vice President Adam Mayberry.
Here.
Trustee Dr. Nicolette.
Good morning.
Trustee J.J. Phoenix.
Present.
Madam President Beth Smith.
Here.
Trustee Colleen Westlake.
Here.
Clerk Woodley here. And Student Annie Batavia. Here. All present and accounted for.
Fantastic. Okay, so before I move on, we do have Dr. Nicolette on the screen, and so every so often, just so everyone knows, we'll make sure to go to her. We'll keep an eye out for her hand being up, and so we'll all take deliberate practices to make sure that she's involved, because it always can feel a little bit separated when you have somebody attending virtually as well. Okay, so moving on to our Pledge of Allegiance, we have a new face here at the dais. We are normally used to our Chief Legal Counsel, but today we have our Deputy Legal Counsel, and so Ms. Sarah Montalvo, will you please lead us in the pledge? All right, and now we'll move on to item 1.04, our land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in the hope of a better life. Some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We acknowledge that some of our educational structures are situated in the traditional homelands of the Washoe, Washoe, Nukmu, Northern Paiute, Nihui, Western Shoshone, and Nuwu, Southern Paiute peoples. We pay respect to their elders past and present. These lands continue to be a gathering place for Indigenous peoples, and we recognize their deep connections to these places. We extend our appreciation for the opportunity to live and learn in their territory. Thank you. So that closes item 1.04 and section 1 in its entirety, and we will move on now to section 2. These are our items for presentation, discussion, information, and or action, and we have one very big item, which we will now open. It is item 2.01, the presentation and discussion regarding the Washoe School District's fiscal year 2025-26 budget process and status, and possible action to direct the superintendent to analyze and report back to the Board of Trustees specific budget issues, items, or other changes to the district's fiscal year 2025 to 26 budget process. This is an item for possible action. With us today, we have in front of us our Chief Financial Officer, Mark Mathers, and our Budget Director, Jeff Bozzo. And before they take it away, I think we would be remiss to not acknowledge and praise that this team and the larger team that they represent have done a really extraordinary job in an unprecedented situation. Normally, we would have had our first budget meeting by now. Some things occurred which we will discuss in this meeting, but the short version of this opening is to really offer praise and recognition that our finance team has put together something for a meaningful and substantive conversation, although a lot of things are in flux and technically information is changing nearly by the day. So just wanted to offer that recognition and let you guys get started. And along the way, we'll be talking amongst ourselves about what votes could look like, what analyses look like, and what all of these parts and pieces, how they all play a part in the work that we'll do roughly over the next 5-ish months. Okay. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Take it away.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you all for being here. Really, the purpose of this discussion is just for staff to start engaging our board on how the fiscal year 25-26 budget will be prepared and constructed. And that fiscal year is the fiscal year, again, starting July 1 of 2025. It's roughly 6 months from now, carrying through to June 30th of 2026. So, again, the purpose of really the discussion this morning, which is, a little later than we normally like to do it, is to cover what we know about the state budget, and then to start laying out the budget process and timeline for you all. Along the way, we'll cover, again, what we think we know about the state budget as of this point. And as President Smith acknowledged, there's been a fair amount of confusion and uncertainty about the state budget and the process that we've kind of gone through to this date. So we've done our best to lay out what we know at this point. This presentation was prepared and finalized last Thursday. There was some additional information dropped late Friday afternoon. We will correct a couple issues where we thought we knew what the case was, but the documents dropped Friday kind of corrected that situation. So again, this kind of sets the stage for future budget conversations. And, for those listening that may ask, well, why do you start talking about the state budget when, right, this is about the district's budget process? And as you know, we don't really control our destiny in terms of the resources we have to budget. 99% of our general fund revenues come from the state. So whatever happens in Carson with the state budget and the state education fund budget really controls what you have to spend. Now, this board does control its destiny in terms of deciding how to spend it, but it doesn't decide how much revenues there are, i.e. how big that pie is. That is controlled, like I say, in Carson City, and that will come out of the legislative session that'll be hopefully completed on June 2nd. So that's why we, again, start with this discussion of the state budget. We'll continue that discussion to the next budget work session on the 25th as we know more, but we'll get into it. And so just in terms of the agenda in front of you, we'll actually start with Jeff going through some of the building blocks to the budget process. Superintendent Ernst will go over his budget priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. Then we'll get into the state budget. We'll also touch on the federal funding situation, another source of some uncertainty for us. And then we'll conclude with some of the known impacts to our own budget and conclude with just the timeline. And along the way, we're always open to feedback, questions, etc. So don't feel bad about interrupting if need be. Yes.
And I'd like to just plus one onto that. So this is a work session. Legally, there's no designation between a work session versus a regular meeting. But the vibe of it, particularly for our newer colleagues and for also having Dr. Nicolette on the line, is to have a conversation. So if there's something that you have a question on, if it's addressed later, they'll mention that, or we can talk about it. So it's really meant to be a dialogue. Sometimes when we do our presentations, we kind of let them go through the things, but it's absolutely okay for us to be talking through these things.
All right, we'll move on to the overview of the budget process. So during the legislative year, as Mark alluded to, the kickoff is really the governor's budget or the governor's recommended budget because our revenues are decided by the state. During the budget process, we have structure, and that structure is around our strategic priorities, so the strategic plan or budget priorities that we'll go over in a few moments. And also our budget principles, which I'll get to on the next slide. We're also, Mark and I are meeting with department chiefs to go over their budgets, develop what their needs are and align with our budget priorities, and also re-looking at their budget for opportunities for savings or way to do things differently. Starting back in September, we started modeling different budget scenarios based on enrollment, labor costs, and state revenues. We've showed you, I think it was a little over a year ago, our 4-year financial plan. It's a really cool tool. We won't bore you with that right now, but it's exciting for us. And then the course of the economy is a pretty major theme here. So in December, the State Economic Forum meets to project revenues, and the governor's budget is confined to those projected revenues. Then again in May, the State Economic Forum convenes again to update their revenue projections, and that's what the final revenues that the state's budget will be determined by. So May is a major point in the budget process. Again, we'll touch on that a little bit later, but the course of the state's economy is a big deal in this process. And then again, throughout the process, we'll come to you with budget recommendations based on priorities and also opportunities for new investments, or if we need to make some cost reductions or realign certain things with our budget priorities, we'll bring those recommendations as well. And the budget process goes through the end of June, so you'll get used to seeing us up here on a regular basis. So getting into our board fiscal policies, the first one here listed is a structurally balanced budget, and my apologies, I should say board policy 3110 there. But a structurally balanced budget is when your recurring revenues are equal to or greater than your recurring expenditures. Maintaining a structurally balanced budget is a sound fiscal policy. We've had 6 straight years of structurally balanced budgets in the general fund. I think that speaks to the board's discipline in maintaining this budget policy here, and also to the importance of it. Our unrestricted ending fund balance target is 12%, so that's 12% of general fund expenditures. And then also during the budget process, and number 3 here, the starting point for a budget is you roll what you currently have forward, and then that's not the ending point. We're reviewing the budget in a strategic way. Does everything align with our strategic plan and our budget priorities? Are there things that don't anymore that should be realigned? Are there patterns of spending that are below historical levels and we can rebase department budgets? And then also that long-term perspective and that multi-year financial plan I spoke to a few moments ago. There's also Nevada revised statute requiring strategic priorities for a district's budget. So that would be our strategic plan, and also the budget priorities that Superintendent Ernst will get into in the next slide. Last year, you'll recall that our budget process was centered around our strategic plan and major themes. So we do follow this law, just so you know. And with that, I'll hand it over to Superintendent Ernst to discuss the budget priorities for this year.
Thank you, Mr. Boswell. Thank you, Mr. Mathers. So as we're looking forward to the strategic priorities, many of them remain in place as we have identified over this past half year or so, and certainly all line up with our strategic plan. We look at chronic absenteeism continuing to be fundamental in the work that we're doing, working to improve academic achievement for our students. We also look at special education, our English learners, as well as early childhood education. Certainly, many educators intuitively understand what an investment early childhood education is, and so by being able to make this investment and continuing to build seats for students, we think that we can make some progress that way. Again, that feeds to that overall academic achievement. Recruiting and retaining high-quality staff continues to be really at the forefront of our efforts. As you're aware, we have Assembly Bill 49. We continue to push on that at all levels and really believe that the better that we can recruit and retain high-quality staff, the better that's going to be for our students, for our families, and for our staff. Increasing operational efficiency continues to be a way of trying to recoup some costs and help us operate at higher levels. So we'll continue to look at all areas of operational efficiencies that we can gain. We've talked to you a little bit about the ERP system previously, and we'll continue to look at a number of operational efficiencies across all departments, and then continuing to strengthen climate and culture, just recognizing we're the 8th largest employer in the state of Nevada, employ nearly 9,500 employees. And so recognizing how important it is to make sure that we are strengthening and maintaining a strong climate and culture.
Really quick while we stay on this slide, just for anybody who's following along, or for all of us as we go through this, because it will be a different budget process than previous years no matter what. Can we talk for a brief moment about how these specific priorities will come at a later time, just to kind of flesh out that you've gone through the overview of it, but what this looks like in the recommended practice would come at a future budget meeting, right?
Yes. What we would like to do is, again, we'll be seeing you every month through June to discuss kind of the options that and recommendations that staff have come up with. And what we'd like to do is present those options and recommendations to you in these categories. So we will come to you to talk about what our solutions are for chronic absenteeism. And then we'll come to you, again, kind of with a chapter for special education, English learners, early childhood, and so forth. So we'd like to keep to these themes or priorities as we talk to you so that you can look at them right in through that lens versus giving you 100 kind of options, recommendations that aren't ordered in any particular way, if that makes sense.
I'd say that looks like it makes sense. And so later on in this meeting, when we consider, or if we consider like specific analyses that we're asking for, it's totally okay if, obviously they should fall within these categories, but the things that this board may take a vote on to say, I'd like to see a specific analysis of this, it turns out maybe staff was also going to bring the same thing as well, but it also provides clarity that the board has interest in certain areas, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it later today.
Absolutely. And this really helps us focus, right? This sets our priorities and prioritizes what we will really focus on during budget deliberations with staff and the chiefs and the executive team, right? This is where our attention will be. So these are guiding principles for the process. Okay, so let's talk about the state budget and what we knew as of last Thursday. So you'll recall the governor gave his State of the State speech on January 15th, and then later that day released his recommended budget. Unfortunately, the Legislative Council Bureau and the media had identified a $335 million shortfall in that budget. And I won't go into how the state budget's prepared and some of the nuances of that, but that caused a pause in the process. Really, the state couldn't move forward until the governor presented budget amendments to correct that issue. And those came last week, where the governor's office presented a slew of budget amendments rectifying that situation in large part using one-time monies and carryover savings to fund ongoing costs. So a little different approach than what we use, but they did cover the gap. Unfortunately, what we heard last week was that there was an error identified by the state in their funding of the state education fund, and they decreased their funding of the transfer to that fund by $52 million. So that was one way in which they covered that $335 million deficit. We, as of last Thursday, were waiting for the revised state budget to be released. I don't actually think there will be a revised state budget document. Instead, what the state seems to be choosing to do is just release the budget amendments. And then so you have to take the base budget and apply the budget amendments to kind of see where we're at, more or less. Again, budget documents dropped last Friday late afternoon, so we didn't have time to amend this presentation. But we'll go through what, again, we know as of this date. There will be hearings later this week that we'll be paying close attention to that will hopefully provide further clarity on the state education fund budget. And as Jeff mentioned, all of this is somewhat a prelude to May, when the Economic Forum, a body of experts, re-meets and adjust general fund revenues either up or down. Normally in the last several bienniums, it's been up. I can't say for sure that'll be the case in May. We'll just have to see. But that's kind of, the overview of kind of the process that's happened to date. So the State Education Fund has one main account, the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan account, and this is how school districts are funded by and large. This is a revenue-driven budget. This is not like a cost-plus based budget where we take all the school districts' budgets and apply an inflation factor and adjust those budgets up like we used to do with the old Nevada plan. This is really the new funding formula, the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, really says whatever you take in terms of revenues and sources is what you get to spend. So if we have, like the current biennium, a situation where revenues are anticipated to grow greatly, great. You have a lot more money to allocate towards programs and compensation increases and so forth. If those sources are flat, that's what you end up with. So it's just what you get is what you get to spend. As you can see here under sources, there's really only three main sources to this account. It's not a very diversified set of revenues that goes into the State Education Fund. The State General Fund transfer is roughly a $1 billion out of the total $5 billion State Education Fund budget, so roughly 25%. That is kind of the only discretionary part of this revenue mix. That is the amount that the state will transfer from its general fund to the State Education Fund. And so when the state's preparing its budget, constructing its budget, it has to decide how much do we want to support K through 12 versus higher ed or corrections or welfare programs, health and safety programs, and so forth. So they do have discretion about how much they want to spend within kind of the confines of SB Senate Bill 543 from the 2019 session that did set some parameters, but they don't actually technically legally have to follow those parameters. So that's where we focus on and pay attention to, because there's, like I say, there's the discretion in this pie. 40% of state education fund revenues, or a little bit more than $2 billion of the $5 billion, come from sales tax, the local school support tax. That's the 2.6% of the sales tax we pay. And we'll talk about that in a second. Property taxes is another $1 billion of the $5 billion or so, and that property tax is shown on your bill as the 75-cent school operating rate. So it's 75 cents across the state. And then the rest, roughly 10 to 13% are other revenue sources like the marijuana tax, like the room tax, some other sources there. So those revenues come in, the state makes projections on them. We look at them to gauge their reasonableness, but generally they're pretty reasonable forecasts. And so again, whatever we receive in sources statewide is what gets allocated to those uses on the right, no more, no less. And as you can see there, base per pupil funding, which is the name for the funding we use for the general education of all students, and which goes to pay the vast majority of our teachers, is roughly 80% of the pie. 80% of that $5 billion or $4 billion. And the rest goes to either special education or weighted funding. Special education is maybe 10% of the pie. Weighted funding maybe, and auxiliary funding is the other 10%. So again, what the state takes in is what gets distributed to school districts.
Yeah, just a rudimentary question, since we're talking about this. Probably a fourth grade level question for you. But the revenue that the state brings in that the county gets, I mean, that's statewide. I mean, it comes from all the counties, Clark County as well. You talked about the room tax. What about is there a gaming piece?
Yeah, there's slot tax. We get a portion of the slot tax, the tax on slot machines.
I just, it's just puzzling to me that with all the gaming we have in this state that we don't get a bigger,
Right.
that education they don't invest more in education with respect to the gaming side.
No, they really don't. I mean, those gaming revenues go into the state general fund. The state education fund, you're right, gets very little of gaming revenue.
And how much marijuana tax essentially goes to education? Because there's this idea out there that when they legalize the medical and then the recreational side, that we were going to be flush with cash.
Yeah.
I hear that a lot.
Yeah.
It's not substantial.
Yeah, and so this was a really tough issue for a while in that the state was peeling off a portion of the marijuana tax and it was going into the state general fund. They did correct that, I think it was 4 years ago or so that the vast majority of marijuana taxes do go to education. It amounts to between 125 and 150 million a year between the wholesale tax and the retail tax. So it's, it's something, but it's, for a $5 billion budget, it's a small piece. Yeah. So again, last week we saw budget amendments processed by the state.
I'm sorry, Mark, hold on one moment.
sorry.
Trustee Wesley?
I did. I thought I read in there on the LSST sales tax that it was like flat.
Yeah, we'll talk
So
about.
people
Yeah.
aren't buying stuff?
We'll talk about that in a couple of
Okay.
slides.
All right.
But yeah, you are correct. It's very flat. So again, on last week, this, as noted, the governor's office made a series of budget adjustments to cover the $335 million deficit. One of those was reduction in the state transfer. We assumed that would be in year one of the biennium. They actually, when we looked at the budget documents that were dropped on Friday afternoon, it's actually year two of the biennium that they made that reduction. We will again report to you on the 25th with more specifics. So here is the pupil-centered funding plan broken out by kind of major source. And I know this is kind of a busy chart, but if you could focus on the bars to the right first, you'll see that total funding, and again, this was based on the assumption that the reduction was made in year one, but these numbers don't change dramatically. Total funding in the pupil-centered funding plan account of the state education fund goes up 2.1% in fiscal year 26, and then 2.4% in fiscal year 27. So it is incredibly flat, if not low. The bars to the left break out, again, pupil-centered funding revenues not including the state general fund transfer on the left, and then the middle, the state's actual general fund transfer. So I'll start in the middle. So when we talk about how much has the state increased its support for K through 12, its transfer to K through 12, again, there's going to be some slight changes in the numbers here based on the actual plan, but not greatly. The support to K through 12 increased 3.9% in fiscal year 26, and then drops by 1.9% in fiscal year 27. So kind of a net increase over 2 years of 2%, 1% per year. That growth in support for K through 12 is lower than the growth of the state general fund revenues as a whole. And then when we look at just the other revenues, the pieces of the pie not including the state general fund transfer, revenues are only going up 1.5% in fiscal year 26, and then 4% in fiscal year 27. So all around, very flat growth. Again, this is what's going to constrain the allocations of funding to all school districts in the state. Maybe to speak a little bit more to Vice President Mayberry's question. So again, all revenues coming from all regions of the state are put in a pot basically. Then there's equity adjustments, kind of a black box process that then generates what we all, each individually as school districts receiving per pupil funding. So Clark County sales taxes are mixed in with Washoe County school taxes and the other 15 counties, and right, it goes into this funding model that then is washed through various equity adjustments and spits out what each school district gets.
And I think you have this in your slides, but those equity adjustments have not historically been kind to Washoe. I know we've balanced that out, and thanks to your participation on the Commission on School Funding, I know you've been championing that, but a lot of those equity adjustments have not been kind or in favor of our own particular district.
That's right. Okay, so Trustee Westlake asked about sales tax, so the next slide covers that. What happened last biennium, again, think about the Economic Forum, this panel of industry experts, not state officials, have to do. They have to project out revenues 2 years in advance, and they only have a part of a fiscal year's trends to make that projection. Really difficult. What they were seeing back in late 2022 and early 2023 was sales tax was going through the roof. We unexpectedly, right? So we were coming out of COVID, and there was a concern that the economy would be crushed based on the restrictions that went along with COVID. Instead, the federal government, right, passed bills that basically pumped trillions of dollars into the economy. And what we saw then was households spending at a far greater clip of sales tax than we'd ever seen really before. Because if you remember, you were stuck at your house. You're sitting in front of a computer. Eventually, you end up on Amazon, and eventually you end up buying something. And so we saw this shift away from services that aren't taxed to goods that are. And so we saw this really steep curve growth for sales tax. Well, the Economic Forum, seeing that, right, you see that, they kind of projected more or less a normal trajectory for sales tax after that. What we've actually seen is sales tax performance far lower than that statewide. And so the gap between the projected sales tax that's in the light blue in fiscal year 24 and actual sales tax, which is in orange, was $90 million. Actual sales tax came in $90 below budget in fiscal year 24. Again, as people's spending habits change and they go back to spending your travel. Well, we don't get sales taxes when you're staying at a hotel in Hawaii, right? So now they're spending their dollars back to what was kind of more a traditional mix of goods versus services. And again, goods reflects maybe a third of the economy anymore. So they've kind of flipped their spending habits. They don't have the federal stimulus dollars to spend anymore, so households are a little bit more cautious in how much they spend. So far in fiscal year 25, and we haven't seen the December season yet, but so far in fiscal year 25, sales taxes are down compared to fiscal year 24. So what we did in the second set of bars is just modeled, if it continued on that trajectory, what the shortfall would be, and you can see it's sizable. So what the Economic Forum did when it met in December of 2024 was reset its sales tax projections based on what they have seen and what we have seen. And so you can see that third light blue bar is lower than what was projected in fiscal year 25, right? Significantly, as they've seen what's going on and adjusted downward their projection. So that's the long and the short of why sales tax is just so weak, which negatively affects the state education fund pie, size of the pie, because again, sales tax represents 40% of the state education fund revenues. So when the slice representing 40% is zero or negative, you've got problems. So that's what's happening there. In terms of state support, the next slide, I know this is busy. What we did was separate it out. So you heard the governor commit to extending SB 231 funding, which is a good thing. So we have bipartisan support to continuing Senate Bill 231 funding for compensation increases. For our district, that amounted to roughly a 4% cost of living adjustment for our employees. Statewide, that's kind of what it averages out to as well. So in his State of the State, he talked about continuing that funding. We've broken out the funding of SB 231 compensation versus the rest of the K through 12 budget. And I'll explain, or hopefully along the way you'll understand why. So if I isolate the bottom of that chart in SB 231 funding, the state general fund covers that this biennium. It's $125 million a year, $250 million total. That comes out of the state general fund. What the governor's proposed is to transfer money out of the general fund to the state education fund next biennium. He's expanded that compensation increases to charter schools, which is why it goes up to $144 million. So net, the state's commitment to SB 231 funding goes up $38 million, but it remains basically a state general fund commitment. So then if we go back to the top of the chart to see what remains for all of our staffing and programs we fund now, you can see that in fiscal year 25 that amounted to $1.488 billion. That's how much the state transferred into the state education fund. In fiscal year 26, it goes down to $1.40 billion. And then in fiscal year 27, it goes down to $1.37 billion. So you're going to hear a lot of numbers thrown out there. One of them compares the last biennium, actuals for fiscal year 24 plus budget for fiscal year 25 to the budgets for fiscal year 26 and 27, and you're going to be told it goes up. And it does go up now. You can see in that column, biennium over biennium, that includes, it goes up $147 million on paper. But if you look at fiscal year 25 versus fiscal year 26, and then fiscal year 27, you can see what is there to fund everything but SB 231 goes down. So, you know, numbers are tricky, and that's why some people can say it goes up. But if you look at fiscal year 25 budget to fiscal year 26 budget, which is how we would look at it, it goes down. Overall, in total, you can see fiscal year 25 versus fiscal year 26. If you factor in the state general fund support for SB 231, it goes down. Now again, biennium over biennium, one can argue it went up, but that's not how we look at budgets, right? So that's the slide covering state support. Again, why this is so important is because all the revenues that go into this fund, including the state general fund transfer, funds those following functions: the adjusted base per pupil funding that goes to fund the general education of every child, weighted funding that provides for the additional support, English learners, gifted and talented and at-risk students, and then the local piece of special education funding. When we look at that first area, adjusted base per pupil funding, what we heard last week from the governor's office lips was that the statewide adjusted base per pupil amount increases from $9,414 in fiscal year 25 to $9,416 in fiscal year 26. It went up $2 per student, or 0.02%. And then it goes up $70 in fiscal year 27, which is less than 1%. So if you're a district whose enrollment stayed flat, right, and nothing else changes, basically your adjusted base per pupil revenues go up 0.02%. So, you know, again, this is the governor's recommended budget. The legislature is going to look at it. We're going to have a May Economic Forum that'll get revised. Budgets won't be really finalized until late May. So there's a lot of room to go. But this is our challenge that we have. This is what we were told was the statewide average per pupil amount. This isn't what Washoe will get, so we'll have to kind of wait and report back to you in fiscal year 20, on February 25th what our actual number is, but on a statewide basis, this is what the governor's office presented to the legislature last week.
Really quick, just going to take a pause and see if Trustee Nicolette has any questions up till this point. I just want to deliberately make sure that we invite in your voice. Dr. Nicolette, if you have any questions, if not, we'll just keep going.
I'm fine. Thank you for taking care of me.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move to weighted funding next. And again, this is based on the original January 15th governor's recommended budget. And these are statewide amounts that we'll go over here, not specific to our school district. So English learners funding is set to increase 4.1% from FY25 to FY26. At-risk funding is set to decrease by $43.9 million or 21% in the upcoming fiscal year compared to the current fiscal year. And then gifted and talented funding is set to increase by 17.2%. Then looking at FY27, each of these weighted funding categories is set to decrease by 0.1%.
I know we're going to do this on the next slide, but this is based on the budget that was $335 million in the deficit, but we don't have any idea what this looks like actually even right now.
That's correct.
Okay.
And it's easy to misinterpret the numbers, right? And think, okay, English learner funding increased 4%. Great, that must be 4% inflation. What we don't know or didn't know last week, that could reflect just more English learners statewide, right? So we don't know how much of that growth really reflects an inflation factor versus just the growth in the number of students that the state has to cover. So the actual amount per student doesn't necessarily go up 4%.
Looking at special education funding, again, based on the original governor's recommended budget, the local special ed amount in the people-centered funding plan does increase. That's not necessarily new funding. It's just to match what districts have historically transferred from their general fund to cover a shortfall in state special ed support. And looking at the next bullet here, the state special education budget increased 2.7% in FY26 and 1.9% in FY27. That's barely enough to cover employee step increases. That doesn't cover increased costs for special education services if more students are identified as needing special education services. So districts will need to continue their general fund support to special education for that shortfall.
I'm going to keep jumping in just again, so as everyone's following along or referencing this, it is so important that we just get the information out as a baseline as we have further conversations. Give or take, can you confirm that approximately for the amount of money that the Washoe County School District spends to meet the needs of our special education students, approximately, we only receive about 48% of those costs, which means that the tremendous lion's share, the other 52%, is actually being pulled from our general education, our general fund. So we only get around 48% right now, and then we have to pay the rest of that out of our general fund. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's about correct. In FY24, we spent or transferred $71 million from the general fund over to the state special education fund. So that was the general fund contribution. Moving into early childhood funding. So in the last biennium, there was one-time funding for the early childhood innovative program, and that was about $70 million per year. That was in the governor's recommended budget, once again, at the tune of $70 million a year. So we do receive some of that funding. Forgive me, I don't have the exact amount, but the levels for that program are proposed to stay at the same level. The Nevada Ready Pre-K, grant is proposed to decrease by $1 million in FY26. And then this isn't pre-K, but our adult ed and career and technical education funding from the state, those are two of our larger state grants. The funding remains flat in both FY26 and FY27 there. And now I'll hand it back to Mark to talk about some other items.
So again, one of our concerns has been one of the equity adjustments in the funding model that is called a cost of wages index. We weren't sure whether that index was being applied again to districts' allocations. I am happy to report that when we looked at documents dropped on Friday, that adjustment is not being made. Every district is set to 1.0, which is consistent with the unanimous vote of the Commission on School Funding not to make that equity adjustment. So that's good news. Some of the other areas of concerns, again, weighted funding, as this board's talked about several times. The state only funds one weight, even when a student is in more than one weight. We estimated that to be a $20 million impact to our budget. So again, if a student's an English learner but also gifted and talented, they're only going to get funded for English learners, but we have to provide the services for gifted and talented. So we end up having to use our general fund dollars to cover that cost. Again, we've estimated that impact to be approximately $20 million.
And so on that, Mark, special education is included in that, even though there's so everybody has the same baseline. There's the three weighted funding categories of at-risk, English language learners, and gifted and talented. Although it's not a weighted funding, there's also the special education fund, but the state will only give you one of those four.
That's right. That's right.
And then, I just for total baseline. And then can you also explain that the 20 million is what our own district has to pay for students that are designated in all those categories, and where that $20 million comes from?
Yeah, so when we have a student in more than one category, we can't choose not to provide them with English learner education or at-risk funding. And so what happens is, to cover that cost, we have to transfer or use general fund monies, which again are supposed to go to the general education of every. Instead, we have to divert what we've estimated to be 20 million to cover that unfunded cost in that second or third weighted category. And then a large question for us is at risk. Again, we've seen great volatility in that funding among school districts from year to year. And as Jeff noted, we saw a big drop in funding for at risk, and we're not sure why. So we hope to understand better later this week about what's going on and why the state would be reducing funding in that area so significantly, more than $40 million per year. It could be a number of reasons, and I don't want to speculate, but hopefully, again, we'll hear why in hearings later this week.
And so on that note, the reason why I keep breaking in is it's like this needs to be an eyes wide open process. I am of the personal opinion that there is a dramatic misunderstanding about funding for education in Nevada. We're very lucky to have, in my opinion, the best of the best in terms of CFOs for districts, really maybe across all government entities here in Nevada, and Mark and his team. And so it is, in my opinion, so important to just level set all of this. And also in the hopes that people do listen to this and maybe different perspectives are told, because this is all factually accurate. We need to be eyes wide open with what we're dealing with, because there is, in my opinion, such a misunderstanding about education funding and all of those things, and we're just creating, a level set of facts. Thanks.
That's right. So we wanted to touch base just on a few slides about federal funding. Unfortunately, this is another area of uncertainty in our lives. Obviously, there's been talk about defunding the U.S. Department of Education and uncertainty about what that would mean for Department of Education programming and funding. Last month, we went through a fire drill where there was, the federal government announced a pause in funding all of the federal program funding for our programs. a judge put a halt to that, and then the federal government reversed that pause. But, you know, we continue just to hear almost, well, weekly, you know, rumors of a particular program that may be reduced or paused. And so we wanted, again, in terms of just transparency to you and to our public, go over how much we do receive from the federal government. So from the U.S. Department of Education, we receive a total of $37 million of new funding in fiscal year 25. There's carryover funds, but in terms of what we were allocated in terms of new funding, that total is $37 million. A little less than $13 million goes to our Title I schools to support those students in the highest poverty categories. You can see what that goes to. It amounts to 36 elementary schools, including 3 of our district-sponsored charters, 8 middle schools, and 5 high schools, as well as 3 of our alternative schools. We use that, again, to fund positions at those schools and programming and other supports. The second largest category of U.S. Department of Education funding is the IDEA program. This is the federal government's contribution to funding special education services, which, you know, is in the realm of 10-12% of total costs. That amounts to $12.5 million. So we're legally obligated, of course, to provide services to special education students, and the federal government picks up, again, maybe a 10th to 12% of that total cost. Then the remainder are either what are called entitlement programs, programs that are set in law, that at least based on the best legal minds right now believe that it would take an act of Congress to defund those programs, but that may play out in the courts. And then there's Department of Ed discretionary grant programs. These are programs that the agencies have authority over and probably I would consider the most vulnerable. So among our entitlement programs, Title IIA, Title III, Title IVA, Perkins Grant for CTE, Title VI for our Native American Indian education programs, right? Those are important programs, obviously. And then you can see in the last category what's covered there, including homeless services, again, some additional Native American programs, and just a smattering of other programs. And when I say smattering, that probably implies that they're not important, and they really are. These students really rely on these programs. So again, total of $37 million we received from the federal government, and if there were cuts there, we would have to talk about how to cover the costs of those programs if we could. That would be a major issue for us. And then in terms of other federal funding, the biggest one is from the U.S. Department of Agriculture for nutrition services programs to feed our children. A total of $29 million is received from the federal government for our CEP, Community Eligibility Provision Program. This is the program we use to provide free breakfast and lunch for all students at 68 of our schools, including 4 district-sponsored charter schools. So we have continued to expand the CE program more and more each and every year, including subsidizing that program for, I think it's 7 schools to the tune of $500,000 per year. We also receive funding in non-CEP schools, free and reduced breakfast and lunch for those who qualify under the income limits. So that's another source of federal programming there included in $29 million. So it's the vast bulk of funding for a nutrition services program comes from the federal government, more than 90%. So that's a significant category for us. And then you can see there we have, again, some other grants from other federal departments and the American Recovery Plan Act, a little bit left there.
Thanks. So on that point with the federal funding, Mr. Mathers, in the circles that you associate with, in the worst case scenario, the Department of Education is dissolved, that money go to the states?
I think,
It was all speculation.
yeah, it's a lot of speculation. The speculation I hear, if you want me to kind of share what I'm hearing, right, is that those programs wouldn't necessarily be eliminated. Those distributions would continue to go to the states, maybe in more of a block grant way. But it's all conjecture. Along with that, there are rumors of reductions to title programs. And we should know later this spring how that plays out. But again, all bets are off. So right? But so they don't necessarily go hand in hand, the dissolving of the U.S. Department of Education and funding, but they could. So that I know I'm not really answering your question, but they're not. They could be unbundled, if you will.
No, I appreciate that. There are so many known unknowns. I almost think we should just talk about the budget in 3 months from now. I mean, I say that tongue in cheek, but yeah.
Okay, next we'll talk about major factors impacting the FY26 general fund budget. I'm going to skip ahead a few slides. I think this will help explain what we're about to get into. So when we're building our base budget for FY26, our base budget is a snapshot of current expenditures and revenues, and then we adjust that for things that we know. So on the expense side, we're adjusting based on projected enrollment and what staffing looks like for the next year, along with any known salary and benefit changes. So we'll go over enrollment here in a moment, and then also the PERS rate increase. And then we also have fixed costs related to the opening of Debbie Smith that we'll go over as well. Then if we go down here to the revenue section, again, enrollment impacts our revenue. And so we'll go over that as well. So going back, the first item we'll talk about is enrollment. So as you can see in this chart here, we've had declining enrollment for several years, in part to two major factors: declining birth rates and the opening and expansions of charter schools and private schools in the area. That trend is continuing into the next 2 years, with a projected enrollment decrease of 1,025 students for the FY26 budget. And FY27, we're looking at a enrollment decrease of over 1,800 students. A major part of that is the expected opening of the Matter Academy charter school that it's expected to open with 790 students. So at our current per pupil rates our FY25 per pupil rates of $9,705 per student, that would be in a projected enrollment, a revenue loss based on enrollment of $9.9 million in FY26 and another $17.9 million in FY27. So when we come to you on the 25th with the preliminary estimate of the general fund, you'll see the revenue adjustment as a line item there. Next is the PERS rate increase. So Nevada PERS is the Public Employee Retirement System, and this is the retirement rate that we contribute on behalf of employees to pay for retiree benefit costs. So as you can see in this first table here, in the 2021-23 biennium, that's a starting point for this table. We had significant rate increases in the current biennium, and then we're projected to have significant increases again in the upcoming biennium. Most of our employees fall in that second category called regular employer, where us as the school districts makes the full contribution on behalf of the employee. So that rate is increasing by 3.25%. Both government agencies and employees share in this increase. So this table below tries to show an example of that. So if we take a current employee and the current PERS rate, if an estimated salary is $60,000 for that employee, the current PERS rate of 33.5% results in a PERS cost to the district of $20,100. With the projected increase, the employees, or the guidance from PERS, is that the employee salary schedule is reduced by half of the PERS increase. So in this example, we're looking where most of our employees fall. The PERS increase is 3.25%. So the employee pay reduction is 1.625%. So in that second column on that bottom table, the employee's new salary is $59,025, and it's a pay reduction of $975. That's the impact to the employee. On the district side, with the rate increase to 36.75%, that PERS increase, the net cost of the district is almost $1,600. So when we calculate that across the whole entire district, the impact to the general fund will be a net cost of $4.6 million.
I don't know about anybody else, but this is blowing my mind right now, blowing my mind. And we obviously don't have a say. Here's my question. Does anyone have a say over this? I'll just pick one line item. The fact that the PERS can nearly, as proposed, be almost 60% for, I mean, like, how high are we going to go? I know you don't know the answer to that. Are there any checks and balances on this? Literally anywhere? Like, do we get to weigh in? Does anybody get to weigh in to explain the impacts of all of this? By the way, that is not directed towards you. It is a universal acknowledgement, but not directed to you, of course.
Well, I can tell you we found out by receiving a memo that here's the rate change. And that's typically how we find out about these rate changes. That's all I'll say about that.
I mean,
And there's no checks and balances to this. They can just do this?
Well,
I see your line, and after he answers, you'll.
Well, I was going to ask the same question. So who is it? The PERS, like, who's deciding this?
So the PERS board receives an actuarial report where there's a projection of costs, and there's a projection of revenues, and that's what sets the rate. The PERS board is required to adopt the recommendation of their actuary. Now, there are strategies to mitigate rate increases, and the PERS board has taken advantage of some of them in the past. So, but the PERS board is confined, to that report and those recommendations, and that's what gets presented to the legislature and has to be built into the state budget. I have to believe this is a conversation the legislature is going to have, because it affects the state as well, right?
Yeah.
And it affects every local government in terms of, first they have to cover this additional cost, but then just as importantly, the employee is going to see their salary reduced. And just to be very, very clear, this in the box below didn't assume any COLA increase, right? This would be if they got no COLA, they would get a net reduction on their paycheck.
Right.
So I have to believe it's a conversation the state will have. Maybe there'll be another round of pension reform and another tier of retirement benefits that's created, or something else, maybe in response. But we really haven't heard a lot yet about this, despite this being a massive issue.
So just for clarity, at that matrix there, the green matrix, in that scenario, what percentage of a COLA would an employee need just to break even?
1.625.
Oh, you said that. Thank you.
Yeah.
1.5. Thank you.
Jeff, you're breaking
Yeah, thank you. I get the good slides today. So next we have the Debbie Smith CTE Academy. So when we open a new school, there's a set of fixed costs for typically various positions like principals, deans, counselors, secretarial staff at the school, custodial staff. In this case, we have athletics and additional transportation, and also a high school police officer. That'll all just be the base staffing for Debbie Smith for the 700 students that are set to attend there next year. Those costs are about $4 million for all those positions. And then we also have non-personnel costs for just the school's supply and equipment budget. Also, in the last year's strategic plan budget, high schools were approved to have an intervention or intercession budget, so that will be added for Debbie Smith as well. And then there's utility and maintenance costs included in that number. All in all, the fixed costs for Debbie Smith are $4.5 million, so that'll be an additional cost that you'll see lined out when we go over expenditures at the next meeting. So to just go over the rest of the budget process, again, we touched on this slide earlier. When we build our base budget and make the adjustments for revenues and expenditures, some that we just talked about, what that gets us to is an estimated surplus or deficit. And you'll see that estimate at the next meeting, and that really helps guide us on how do we go forward. If we have a surplus, then what investments do we want to make to spend that surplus? If we have a deficit, then we still might have some investments we want to make, but we also have to find cost offsets and other reductions so that we have a structurally balanced budget. Progress to date. So there was the reorg that went to the board at the last board meeting, and that helped set up the process moving forward, and operations and finance areas will be next. Mark and I have had initial budget meetings with chiefs and departments to review requests that are aligning with the strategic priorities and the budget priorities of the superintendent, and also reviewing major contracts and opportunities for savings. So again, next or 2 weeks from now, we'll have revised allocations with what we know and present either a preliminary surplus or deficit. We already talked about this slide a bit. So timeline, we're over into the February section here where we begin the board budget discussions. There's a long ways to go. As we've talked about, we'll see you every month through the end of June so that we can get our amended final budget filed by the deadline of July 2nd after the legislative session ends. So there's a long way to go. We'll be providing updates. With that, I think we'll open it up to any questions.
So I know we've had the opportunity to all chat. Before we move forward, because I'm likely to go to public comment, I do see we have one guest that has joined us. Dr. Nicolette, I want to give you the opportunity. We've, of course, all been dialoguing, but I want to make sure you have an opportunity to be heard before we go to public comment.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The only thing, two things. Thank you very much, Mark Mathers and Jeff Bozos, for this. This is a wonderful culmination of hours and hours and a very deep dive into a lot of numbers. I will say that I agree with CFO Mathers that from a sustainability lens, it is high time and probably well overdue for a deep dive into the PERS system, because sustainability is a true issue, and I think we recognized that probably 10 years ago, but we continue to kind of bury our head in the sand on this one because it's a very tough issue. And so thank you, Mr. Mathers, for recognizing that. I'm good. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Trustee Nicolette. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Since we've all had the opportunity to chat and I don't see lights on, we will go ahead and we'll move for public comment, and then we're going to take a break. We need to take a break. We'll take a few minutes, okay? And then we're going to come back. And when we do come back, so we're all thinking, we're going to have the opportunity to discuss. And I also kind of have some things based on conversations with all of you and with the superintendent. And we're going to talk about the analyses that we might want to see around certain areas. I know with everything we just heard, you might be thinking, well, gosh, this part is really important. So we don't just get to say we'd like to see this or that. It's something that actually has to be a vote of the board, and it provides direction to the superintendent and to the team about the areas that we are specifically interested in. It could also look like areas that we want for the next budget meeting them to come back to with a deeper dive on. It does not mean we are passing any of these things. It is a way for us to act as a governing body, as a whole, to provide direction around the areas that we want additional information for, or specific financial analyses. This will also guide what the team comes back with us on. It doesn't mean we're necessarily going to do it, but it's really important that we do this part up front so that the team kind of knows where our head is at. Because later in the process, we may be making decisions about areas where we have to invest more in through a full vote of the board, which could also, because everything has to have a checks and balances, which could result in a balancing of another area. And so this part of the process is really important for the rest of the budgetary experience for the team and for the board. And we'll talk more about that when we actually do it and you kind of see the process happening. I think last year, I'm just picking, I think rough numbers, I think we originally passed maybe like 6 analyses and we ended up passing 4 of the 6, give or take, by 1. So again, passing an analyses just tells the team this is work we'd like to see, information we'd like, scenarios we'd like you to create. It does not necessarily mean that we're going to necessarily adopt it. We just need to know that now as we plan ahead. Thank you for that opportunity to just explain that for everybody. And JJ, do we have any public comment?
Kaylin Evans.
Welcome, President Evans.
Hi, for the record, my name is Kaylin Evans, President of the Washoe Education Association. I just wanted to comment first on the themes and strategic priorities. You know, we very much agree with those. We feel like it illustrates a true kind of holistic approach to uplifting our district, so thank you. And I would just want to implore this board to stay aggressive. Right, this board and members of this have really worked to push the envelope on trying things new and looking at different ways to approach some of the same problems that we've had. And given the budget constraints that might likely be ahead of us, we're going to need to think of creative ways to improve working conditions, right, and address student needs. So I just want to say that we need to keep pushing the envelope on that. And I'm always going to go back to understanding the importance of our people, right, like the staff that dedicate their lives to these students every day, day in and day out, the retention of those staffs and retention, right, that there's a lot of areas that fall within that, right? How do we better support our new teachers? How are we addressing student behaviors, the working conditions, and wages, and all of those things need to be at the forefront of how we support our people. And I just wanted to quickly talk about, like our efforts as an association. I mean, we see these budget presentations, we've dove into them thoroughly, and we have hit the ground running. We are full-time in Carson right now. We bring in our first group up on Thursday of educators coming down to the K-12 budget presentation to make sure their voices are heard. We've got a full team down there, both state and local, and we're going to do everything that we can to move the needle on these issues, to bring the type of funding and supports that really uplift every bargaining unit, every student, every employee in our district. And so while we see these things, and obviously there's concerns there, it's reminiscent of last session though too, to a degree, and I'll tell you why. When we went into that building, because of the governor's proposed budget, both sides were like, we're good. Like, governor's proposed budget, this is amazing. Kaylin, I was told there's no way that we're going to get any more funding. And we brought in weekly presence. Over 100 of our members were in that building throughout the entire session. And we hit and we hit and we hit. And I remember sitting in a joint finance committee at the end of the session. And one of the lead senators stood up and she said, she was sitting, but said, we've been hearing from educators day in and day out about the issues they're facing, and we need to do more. And at that point, they put additional $330 million. We pushed through SB 231. So what I'm trying to say is, while we have concerns, we need to use this to kick ourselves into gear. Everybody has a platform. Everybody has a position that they can help advocate, and we need to get to work and make sure that this is the reality when we hit the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And a good reminder as we go into the next phase of this meeting where we talk about the analyses we might be interested in. All right, team, it is 11:19 a.m., so I'm going to call this meeting to a recess until about 11:30. Right, before we call the meeting back to order, just going to check in with Dr. Nicolette.
I'm ready.
Okay. All right, it's 11:34 a.m. on this Tuesday, February 11th, 2025, and I'd like to call back to order the work session of the Washoe County School District Board of Trustees. Before we took the break, we just went through the presentation for item 2.01. We had discussion and we also just had public comment. Took a break and now we are back at it. So team, what we do at this point is we talk about the areas of interest that we have, and ultimately this looks not just like feedback, but if there's an interest to create a motion that would need a second and a vote of the board, and that provides a confirmed interest that a voting majority of the board has an interest in this area of analyses. And now these things can also be refined over time, but it provides the directions, particularly in areas of specificness where we may want an additional presentation at a next budget meeting, areas that we would like to see analyzed, additional support, things like that. And this is a really, really important part of the process. Personally, I appreciate the public comment from President Evans. It was a very good reminder that this is only where we are starting. And we, of course, don't know where we'll land in June, and there's a good deal of advocacy and championing that happens between now and then. So on that note, I will go ahead and I will open it up with one that, of course, I'm interested in, but I also know that this has been a point of interest for many of the colleagues, and that is the area of allocations. So something that I plan on making a motion for, but I want to talk about it because the best kind of motion includes the thoughts from everyone else. But what I've drafted and what I've considered based on our conversations and so much of the interest is a presentation at our next budget meeting that would go over how allocations are done in the district, and not just class ratios, but rather also how classes are allocated going into a new school year. I do not know what is accurate or not. We've had presentations in the past. I've heard things like, leading up to a new school year, a class needs to be like 10 students over before another allocation, or that they have to hold their overage amounts by a certain amount of time. And so just to explore all of that, we've also made some really important and impactful decisions in the past, like with our collaborative schools, which was a special funding that we voted on to provide specific support around Count Day for our 1- and 2-star schools that has, not a surprise, worked out exceedingly well. And so in asking for this, it is not because staff or the district is doing anything wrong. We just saw a presentation that we are landlocked to budget. We make decisions based on the money that we've had. And like in the last budgetary cycle, this board made a decision to allocate a fund of money to provide specific support for 1- and 2-star schools, and also to provide support in 4th and 5th grade for 1- and 2-star schools. And so we would do that process again now. Now, I did think in the last budgetary cycle that we had some funding for mid-year allocations, although I'm not sure how that flushed out this year. I do, because I did read those answers from staff. But that is the crux of the motion that I plan to make, which would be for the presentation at the next budgetary meeting, but then to also direct analyses for alternate approaches. Now, those analyses may not be ready for the next meeting. I would put that in the motion. I don't expect the analyses to be ready. It just signals to staff that after we have the next conversation, we have already voted as a board to direct alternate ways of considering it, because it's all based on money. Staff designates ratios. Staff does allocations 100% based on money. And that fundamentally becomes our own responsibility, because again, where we invest more in, there must be balance in other places. It follows that eyes wide open theme. So I'd really like to, before I make a motion on this, I would like to hear from my colleagues in the area of allocations, because I would want to build in and bring together thoughts if this is something that is of interest to you.
Thank you, President Smith. I know I would appreciate it. I don't want to say I don't understand allocations, because I understand there are allocations, and the reason why we have allocations, and that there needs to be a process and policies in place to develop those allocations. But I have to say, personally, in my heart, I know we have to get these class sizes down. I mean, to me, it's imperative. I mean, these teachers are overwhelmed, and our children are not being able to be served as well as we could if those numbers were down. And I just, for the life of me, I just can't see how we are going to move the needle in the positive direction. And I think it's great to have a baseline allocation. This is how it works. But when issues arise, when there is distress in a classroom, because yeah, the allocations, it's just a general, this is how we figure out the numbers. But when you look at the landscape in any classroom, every classroom is different. Every need is different. Every demand is different. The behaviors are different in every classroom. The whole makeup of the classroom is different from one classroom to another. And I just can't help but think we have a general way to allocate. Great. That's a great starting spot. But then when we see we're having an issue in this classroom and that classroom, I just think we need to do something to support that classroom, or that classroom is going to falter, and it's not going to be as successful as it could be if we just stick in this narrow corridor of this is what we have allocated for this amount of pupils. Again, that's not going to work for every classroom. It's just not. It isn't. It is not working.
So what I'm hearing is that in a potential future analysis, if this motion were to pass, something you might be interested in one of those analyses is a budgetary line item for unanticipated needs.
Absolutely.
Where we don't know next year that a student is going to be heavily impacted behaviorally, and so you are interested in one of these analyses, or a part of this being a fund for unanticipated emergency needs for positions in classrooms that are unanticipated right now.
Absolutely. And I love analogies, because I talk in analogies all the time. So let's look at every classroom as a boat. And we have an allocation of one bucket per classroom in case that boat starts leaking. And that might work for the majority of the classrooms, but some of these classrooms, that boat is going down, and it might need 2 or 3 or whatever amount of buckets to plug all those holes and keep that bucket up above water. And if we could do that, you guys, if we could do that, I think we could make a turn. I think we could make a turn. But you stick to this one bucket per boat, there's boats that are sinking. Yeah. And they're going to keep sinking.
No, I hear you. That's also fundamentally why I hope that the state seriously considers funding all the weights, because if we had the money from the state rather than borrowing from the general fund, I know we would be able to meet a lot of those needs. Absolutely. I'm going to go to Clerk Woodley, and then I see Dr. Nicolette's hand up.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I want to acknowledge the improvements that have been made with regards to allocations. I know a couple years back we made some changes so that we wouldn't lose potential teachers with other agencies, so we appreciate that. But I do appreciate, Madam President, that you brought this up, because this is something we've talked about. We hear it from students, parents, teachers, and principals, so I will definitely be a second on that motion. Thank you.
Are you ready?
You got it.
Thank you. Thank you. Totally hear what my colleague Woodley says. Is I've heard about allocations for years, and we slowly tried to make some process. It's a very complicated beast. Let's just say that. And if you have endless amount of employees who are waiting in line to help, I think it would be a much easier issue to tackle. Having said that, I think it's going to be really important in this deep dive, because this is a deep dive, is to identify the real problems, because it depends on who you talk to what the real problems are. And if it's a problem for your school, you're a principal, you're a teacher, you're a parent, school student, it's a problem. I think what's going to be really important is we identify the specific problems, so that if we're like Trustee Smith, President Smith says, we want to create a pot of money to solve these problems, we have to know where we're throwing that money. And I think that's going to definitely need to come from those people who experience this challenge day in and day out throughout the year. And when we talk about process and policy, that will help us identify what kind of processes that we can support from a emotional standpoint, and then also, of course, from a budgetary standpoint. Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Dr. Nicolette.
I think kind of tag teaming off of what Dr. Nicolette just said, you know, what I hear all the time and what I experienced myself was one of those areas that we really struggle as a district is with our special ed. And we had a lot of public comment last meeting about that. So I think in terms of allocation, I think I would really like to see where we're at as a baseline with our special ed staffing. I know we're low, and a lot of our special ed teachers are having to double up on you know, their lists of students and managing that. So I'd like to see where we're at and where we could get to. So in that allocation conversation.
Okay, very good. I'll make sure to have that there. So I'll make sure that that's included in the motion. The way that I've got this, Bill, and I'll take a stab at it, is, again, to be clear, that only the topic for discussion would be coming back at the next budget meeting, but that analyses would come later at a point to be determined based on the discussion that happens today and going forward, okay? So there's no expectation of analyses at the next meeting, but the conversation that's taken place today, conversations that take place, would inform the analyses you come back with at a point to be determined in the future, okay? Okay, so on that note.
Can I say one more thing?
Of course you can.
Sorry. Because I agree with Trustee Hall here. I absolutely agree. Our special ed is probably one of the boats that really could use some extra buckets, if not a pump. But I do want to bring the attention to everyone, and I'm sure you've heard this on your school visits. It might not be to the forefront right now, but I keep this to the forefront because I know it's causing so much distress. Yes, we have special ed because those children have been identified and they have IEPs, and so we know that they're going to need extra. But there are kids in classrooms, sometimes a handful, 4 or 5 kids with really substantial behavior issues, but the parents are either resist to have EP established with, I'm not going to judge any parent. They have to do what's best for their child. Or we're just, it's not falling into a specific, you know, the peg's not fitting in a certain hole, and so the IEP's not developed. But for whatever reason, there are these significant behavior issues that are not in the special ed, but it still is a huge drain on the time and energy of the instructor, and it is absolutely affecting the other children in the classroom because the numbers in that classroom, and then with those behavior issues that really probably need special support anyhow, like in special ed or some other programs, and it's not there. So I just want people to realize that everybody's not in a specific category to be addressed, but the need is still there, and it is affecting everyone that is in contact with that. So thank you.
And I think I have a way to build that into this too. I see Vice President Mayberry's light on for this discussion on this item, what you might like to see in it.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Yeah, I don't know where to begin. I'll try to summarize it because a lot of my colleagues stole my thunder, and I appreciate that. It makes it easier for me. But I do recognize as one trustee, and I would just encourage all my trustees, my colleagues, to be realistic and don't set expectations too high. You heard the budget presentation. We can't get everything we want. I think that's important. I think, right, clearly special ed is important as well, right? We have behaviors issues. We have new teachers in some cases. I think in the allocation issue, I think communicating my thought processes as well as I wanted to. But I do agree with the allocation piece, and I think when we do a deeper dive on that, I think sometimes there's a disconnect with the state requirements and then the district requirements, because the district can't meet what the state mandates, hence the exceptions that we bring forth quarterly. There's a lot of confusion there. I think it's the time that I've been on this board, I've really struggled to understand that. That's one. And then going back to the special ed piece, and that, as I've visited schools and been a little bit more acutely aware of some of our students that are sight impaired, for instance, hearing impaired, I hope that can be part of the special ed communication or conversation. And I think if we get more help in the classrooms, it's going to go a long way to address some of these, concerns that Trustee Westlake has brought up, Trustee Hull, increasing compensation for aides and assistants. So that's the other piece. And then I want to ask, and please don't get angry with me, I want to ask about ending fund balance. Didn't we 2 years ago, not this current fiscal year, the last fiscal year, didn't we reduce ending fund balance from 12 to a single digit? Or did we not have to?
No, we
didn't. Okay.
Reduce the target fund balance. 2 years ago, we chose to, or you approved a measure to use fund balance for bonuses for special ed positions. So maybe that's
that may be it. I'm just wondering, because we have a board policy at 12%.
We do.
And again, I'm just going to put on the table if there's, Madam President, I don't know how this fits into your motion, but perhaps some analysis on if we reduce that ending fund balance, if that provides more capacity for spending. Does that make sense?
It could, and that would be a different one. So I'm tracking all these notes. So if we don't mind, before we go, because we're going to have multiple of these, okay? And the reason why we all take votes is so that it doesn't turn into, we each have 47 that we would like to see. We have to take a vote to make sure that a voting majority of the colleagues agrees. But I've been keeping track of all of these things, and so I'd like to take a stab at a motion. But before I do, again, the logic behind it, which will be open-ended, we'll cover the things that we've talked about in terms of the budgetary presentation, but still leave it open-ended, because you'll see that it says, but not limited to. But it also provides a vote that directs the superintendent to create analyses following this conversation and the next one. The reason why I'm doing it this way is so that we don't have to take a second vote that we want to see analyses. It's all built in here, but no analyses are expected at the next meeting. It will be reflected in the way that I say this. Okay, so I was tracking all this stuff. JJ, I'm going to apologize in advance, but here's what we got. I move that the Board of Trustees directs the superintendent to prepare a review of the current allocations process to be shared at the next budget meeting and will include, but is not limited to, state and district chosen class size ratios, the process for how allocations are provided ahead of each school year, mid-year allocations, allocations at collaborative schools, how special education students are calculated in both special education and general education settings, count day, and that the superintendent initiate an analysis for alternate allocation approaches for consideration based on board discussion to be determined at future budget meetings.
I second.
Woo! Okay. All right, we're cooking with gas. All those, all those in favor, please, Diane, yes, Dr. Nicolette.
Thank you. There was a lot in there. I'm very hesitant to give a yes on something that I see is so complex that we won't get to where we need to be. I'm not sure that meets whatever goal we're trying to reach, what problem we're trying to solve. So in light of that, JJ, could you please repeat the motion for me? Thank you.
I can.
Okay.
I can. But so just as a reminder, I see, are you pointing to somebody?
Yeah, well, can Mr. Mathers, Mark, can he weigh in on if he conceptualizes this, if he has an understanding of what we're saying, even though we're saying a lot?
Yeah, and if it helps, the reason why the first part is specific is because here's what I don't want to have happen. We all have these areas of interest. We do not know how we may direct spending unless we have the knowledge in these areas. And that's where the conversation would go, because what I don't want to have happen is that this comes forward and we don't properly get a review of how special education is calculated in special education and general education settings. So it's not limited to any of these things, but it directs staff that these are all the things we would be interested in learning more about, because we can't possibly suggest that we would want to move funding or create funding for unless we know the answers for these things. So that was the basis. But CFO Mathers.
No, I think it's pretty clear. Just to confirm, what I'm hearing is you want a presentation on the 25th, and then the analysis would follow.
Yep. And I'm not doing, the reason why I'm not saying specific analysis, just that analysis will happen, because that will be based on board discussion. It'll be based on what we learn. The superintendent and the staff will hear where that conversation goes. Those analyses would come later. I'm not providing specific direction on any areas, just what we want to learn more about, and that will guide the future discussion. But I want to go back to Dr. Nicolette.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Trustee Westlake, I appreciate you asking CFO Mathers, because I think that's important. I would in turn like to ask our superintendent, who will definitely lead this charge, how he sees this unfolding because of its complexity. And again, please read the motion to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Nicolette. I think consistent with what Mr. Mathers said, I think based on the proposed motion, that's certainly information that we can bring back to the team, and I think it'll help round out the thinking and the possible decisions that are in front of us. So we feel comfortable bringing that information to our board to help round out all of the information.
And then I will read that again. Okay. I move that the Board of Trustees directs the superintendent to prepare a review of the current allocations process to be shared at the next budget meeting and will include, but is not limited to, state mandated and district chosen class size ratios, the process for how allocations are provided ahead of each school year, mid-year allocations, allocations to collaborative schools, how special education students are calculated in both special education and general education settings, and count day, and that the superintendent initiate an analysis for alternate allocation approaches for consideration based on board discussion to be determined at future budget meetings. All right, so in that rereading, and I have it written down, JJ, and I know we're recording it as well, too.
Thank you.
Okay, so we don't have Dr. McNeil with us anymore, but she used to talk a lot about loose, tight, loose, tight. So it's really important that we get from this presentation what we hope for, because the worst thing that can happen is someone says, I actually wanted all these other things and now I don't feel. But it also provides plenty of looseness for any analyses that come back to us based on that discussion, okay? Because if we don't get the information we need, there is no way staff could get this right for us. It is unfair of us to not be explicit and then expect something different later. Just from my opinion. Okay, so we've had discussion on the motion, which we haven't for any of the other votes, but that's how discussion on the motion goes in between, because we have a first, we have a second, we had discussion on the motion. So now I will call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, nay. All right, motion carries 7-0. And so now what we would do, and you get to be the next, I wouldn't say guinea pig. I do have more that are based on conversations I've had with you. But for example, Vice President Mayberry, you, if you're interested, may want to make a motion for an analysis at a future budgetary meeting to look into alternate end fund balance approaches, so on and so forth. And that's how this works, if you are so inclined to make a motion as such.
Sure, and let me be clear too. I please understand, this is, I don't support or oppose this, and that's not, what I'm suggesting or leading up to, but I would be interested if my colleagues are interested in understanding the impacts, reducing the ending fund balance, what that looks like in terms of freeing up some more spending, and understanding, the downside of that too. So I'll make a motion for our staff to prepare an analysis on reducing the ending fund balance from 12% in 1% increments. I don't know if I need to be that specific or not. I mean, yeah, and its impact. So again, I move to prepare an analysis on reducing the ending fund balance and its impacts.
I second.
All right, seeing no lights on or hands up, we have a motion by Vice President Mayberry, seconded by Trustee Westlake for an analysis on the end fund balance. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, motion carries 7-0.
Wait, nay. Let's record it properly.
Oh, thank you. We will go back. I will recall for that vote. Okay, thank you so much. So I do have verification here from our Deputy Chief Legal Counsel. We'll go ahead and redo that for clarity and for transparency purposes. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, nay.
Nay.
Thank you very much. All right, so that is a vote of 6-1, so the motion carries. And thank you so much, Dr. Nicolette, for jumping in there and for allowing that clarification. Okay, seeing no other lights on, and again, these ones necessarily aren't me. These are based on, we're listening, we're all listening, we're all talking, we all talk to the superintendent. I have also heard an interest to initiate a review or an analysis around compensating student teachers. This is not just as straightforward as necessarily just funding, but it has a funding component. There could be other elements because we do know some education institutions allow this, others don't. But I do plan on making a motion, just so you know, to direct the superintendent to initiate a fiscal and administrative analysis for compensating student teachers, because we've heard that, which, by the way, might even be what they plan on showing us. It just allows that specificity. And we've honestly been talking about compensating student teachers for well over a year at this point.
Can we include aides in that or no? Does that need to be separate?
We could in a next motion in this to keep it nice and tight, whereas the other one was ginormous. This to me is a little bit more direct. It's a fiscal and administrative analysis for compensating student teachers, who right now, by and large, some of them are paid and some of them aren't. So they're effectively working while they learn but not being compensated. And there's various reasons for that. Okay. So I will, seeing no other lights on, I will take a stab at that I move that the Board of Trustees directs the superintendent to initiate a fiscal and administrative analysis for compensating student teachers.
I second.
All right, so we have a motion by President Smith. We have a second by Trustee Westlake. Dr. Nicolette.
Thank you. On my note, who's second? So when I look at the FYI 26 strategic priorities, I'm trying to figure out where this might fit in. You mentioned that you've had conversations and you mentioned Superintendent Ernst. So I'm wondering if in the conversations it reflected a nod, if you would, toward recruiting and retaining high quality staff. What truly is the intentionality? Is it to have more student teachers want to help with Washoe County School District in the classroom? Is it a recruitment and retention strategy? If you could give me more on this one, please. Thank you.
So the short answer would be yes and yes to both of those, because I believe if there was a way to compensate student teachers, we would also be able to build a pipeline, and to me that goes directly to recruiting and retaining high quality staff. And it also would provide the ability to look into some of the reasons why maybe some of our partner higher education systems don't allow for this. And so it allows that conversation to happen, but with the full understanding and approval of the board that we would like to explore this. Trustee Hull?
As someone who went through student internship and did not get paid, I can say absolutely it has a lot to do. It's a long game for recruitment and retention. This is not something that could possibly change staffing next year, but those of us that have a education but that background know how difficult it is to pay for a full load of classes and work full time and not be compensated. And so it's really actually, there's been studies done nationwide that it's actually preventing people from wanting to go into teaching because just that one semester, and in some states it's a full year where you cannot work and you have to, and with the changes in federal student aid, it's nearly impossible for some people to become teachers. So I think it's really important that we do start to investigate how we can possibly get over that hurdle. And you're right, we do have one particular institute of higher education that does not allow that. So it's an opportunity to have a conversation. But this is a long game conversation. This is not something that's going to change everything next year, for sure. So.
Yeah, and Dr. Nicolette, to answer the other part of your question, which I realize I may not have done, the topic of student teachers and compensating them has come up anecdotally over many years in our board meetings, but we have never taken direction on a position to explore it, and this would be the opportunity for that. It's through board meetings that I even discovered that sometimes student teachers aren't paid. So it's a smattering of conversations that have happened over the course of years, and this provides the direction to explore it more fully. I did see Vice President Mayberry's light on.
Oh, thank you. I know. I just wanted to echo what Trustee Hall said. I mean, you know, some of these teachers, they get paid nothing. I mean, it's a huge sacrifice, and it prevents us from achieving our strategic goal of retaining and recruiting people. So I think it's right in alignment with what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you, President Smith. I just want to say, I know everyone is kind of freaked out because we got some pretty devastating news going over what our budget is possibly going to look like. But for me, I don't know how I possibly can make really well thought out and decisions that will strategically help our district if we don't. It doesn't mean we're going to spend money on all of these things, but if we don't have the information, how can we best move forward with the limited funds we have? And pretty much everything we've already discussed, I really feel, I just want to point this out, I feel that we are all kind of on the same page here. Pillar C, commitment to elevating educators. These student teachers, and hopefully these aides, are our future educators. They've already shown an interest in educating our children and our future adults in our community. So you have a really strong foundation to move forward with. And all of these things we're talking about are all about a commitment to elevating and helping and supporting our educators. And it looks like we're kind of all thinking in the same line here. But again, there's only so much money to go around. So I feel we need as much information as we possibly can get. And I apologize for all of the extra work. But we can't get this wrong, you guys. We cannot get this wrong this year. We can't get it wrong. This is where we're going to really cut our teeth and show that we have the intent to move this district forward. But we've got to have the information. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and call for the vote, but that's exactly right, because there is no way for staff or the superintendent to be successful unless we provide this direction, but it does not mean that these things will be passed at the end of the day. It just gives them clear direction on the areas we're interested in. Okay, so we have a motion by myself, President Smith. We have a second by Trustee Westlake to initiate a fiscal and administrative analysis for compensating student teachers. Great discussion on the motion. Superintendent Ernst.
The only piece I wanted to clarify was there was some mention of aides as well. I just wasn't sure if that is a part of it. This
is not, because I said this one's going to stay laser focused.
Got you there. Yep. Thank you.
And here's why I made the motion. And we do. So what'll sometimes happen is someone will say, I'd like to make a friendly, and we do that all the time. We make amendments. In this case, whereas the other one was like all the things, this is laser focused. We can have that conversation next. This is just this one thing. Okay. All right. All those in favor, please say aye. 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 All those opposed, nay. All right. Motion carries 7-0. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Can I move forward with the aides?
Well, let's talk about it. Share what the idea is, and let's see what everybody's thoughts are, and then we'll see where you might go or someone may go with a motion. It's like what we did with the budget item. That way we could be sure to get everyone's interests.
Okay.
Or not, because it's whoever makes the motion, it's yours.
Okay, thank you. So the reason why I'm advocating this, and I would like to make a motion to see what the impact would be fiscally for aides, is talking with teachers and actually going into classrooms and seeing the dynamics in the classrooms. They're extra bodies when needed. They're extra bodies to assist the teacher. They're extra bodies to pull small groups to the side and give specialized instruction, and to, again, bring those kids up so that everyone is moving forward. And it's very hard. I kind of want to see this, because if we can't really do a lot with cutting down class sizes, I mean, it's just another way to give teachers that need the assistance because of the dynamics in the classroom the support that they need, so that all of these children are getting the benefit of full-on resources in the classroom, the teacher's attention, the dynamics of the teacher, and I think it's going to move us forward. But again, that's why I just want this information to see, and I just think we've got to support our aides.
And I was taking notes during that too. I see your light on, Trustee Hall. Quick question. We have aides and we have assistants. Can you please, just to make sure I have it correct, one of them is a benefited position versus the other one is not? Or is it all just based on the number of hours that they're allocated? I know, or at least I believe it's the 28-hour mark, but is it all assistants do or all assistants don't? Just really quick as I'm drafting this.
Yeah, it's not that all assistants do or all aides don't, but it's based on the number of hours per week, which is 27 and a half.
Okay, and I do know we've heard that can be a challenge, and with that, okay, very good. I'm drafting while you're talking. Trustee Hull.
I think on this note, I think we heard a lot about this at our last meeting with public comment, but I know personally, being in the classroom, but also on all my school visits, the other issue with this is the turnover. And so I'm not sure if we've ever had any kind of information about how much that actually costs our district to have to rehire new people and do the training. And so is there potentially a cost savings just to increase, one thing? Maybe it's the benefits, or maybe it's the a dollar of pay, or whatever that looks like. And that's where that's absolutely beyond my ability. But I'm just curious if that is a problem, because I know personally in my own classroom, I had CLS push in, and I would have 2 to 3 aides a year that we were, and oftentimes the position was open. So I don't know if that's worth including in this, but I think it's a really interesting conversation to wonder what that's costing our district.
So in a situation like this, and I'm drafting up something that I think might be a good fit, Superintendent Ernst wants to chime in. I'll capture a few things in the draft motion for Trustee Westlake's consideration, and then staff is listening, so they also know. Okay, but Superintendent Ernst.
Thank you, Madam President. Just charting and also kind of writing down the different questions, and I know Mr. Mathers, Mr. Bazo are doing the same. Just wanted to make sure I'm getting an understanding of the overall time frame. I know, excuse me, I know we've talked about on the 25th we'll come back with a budget presentation. And then I think also what I'm understanding is that the various motions that have been made, these analysis will then come back at different times throughout the budget process, and that may be in the form of a regular board meeting, it may be in the form of an additional work session. Given the complexity of what has been described and the efforts to quantify and bring this information together, just wanted to make sure I'm understanding as we look towards getting those final budget adjustments in May and then that final budget in early June. So just wanted to make sure I was understanding the totality of the requests.
Yes, and I'd love for CFO Mathers to join the conversation too, but what we did last year, which I thought worked really well, is we had all these analyses. They didn't come back right away. Because CFO Mathers and Finance even then said we need more information. When it did come, which at some point could be March, it could be April, they brought all of them and they said, now we know what we're working with, or we have a better idea. It was still before the economic forum. And then they showed us, these different analyses. Now we might have been talking about some of these topics along the way because staff will come back, just like we did with the budgetary motion. But the analyses tend to come later and we see them and then we have an understanding of what we're working with and then the pieces kind of come together. But I would love to hear about that from CFO Mather's perspective.
No, I think you captured it correctly, that this will be staggered and it might be March, it might be April, it might be May before you see each of or any of these analyses, right? Because, right, if you got them all, it'd probably be overwhelming for you too. So I do think we'll start to lay them out for you. It may be the case you could make decisions maybe on some of them, but more likely you're going to want to wait until the May Economic Forum and the dust to settle on the state budget before we make final decisions. And I think that's what we did last cycle.
Yes, it is. Because of course we might be saying yes to like the first few that come and then, well, we don't have money, but this other one was really great. So we see, we talk, and then the finance team shows us everything, and then we start prioritizing because it also may result in balances. We may direct staff to find balances in certain areas for things we want, but that comes later in the process. Okay.
Thank you, President Smith. I just wanted to say I appreciate so much what Trustee Hall had to add to what I was trying to convey and this is probably a good thing to keep in mind with anything we're talking about. Sometimes just throwing more into the pot before you perfect the recipe, it's not going to be great. So looking at what we're doing with AIDS right now and how we can build on those aides and be supportive of those aides and encourage them to stick around, encourage them to hopefully get into the pipeline of being a teacher is probably, it makes more sense to perfect that than just go, oh, we need 50 more aides kind of thing. So I just think that was great.
Yeah, and I hear you. So let me go ahead and take a stab at what I think I heard you say. I'm going to preface this by saying I believe that staff and the superintendent heard our interest in how we could actually save money because you don't have turnover. But I'm not going to necessarily include that because I think that that's in the conversation. So I'm going to take a stab at it. This is yours, so this would be like so moved or we could play with it, but I'm tracking. And I do this sometimes. So Trustee Phoenix, Trustee Hull, as we're talking, being the meeting manager, I will often write down my own notes, what you're saying, so that we can bring it together. And then if somebody likes it, they say so moved. Okay, so we've got, hold on. I move that the Board of Trustees directs the superintendent to initiate an analysis to include, but is not limited to, compensation, hours allocated, and benefits of aides and assistants of both special education and general education classrooms.
So moved.
So that's not actually my motion. It's going to be hers. So we've got Trustee Westlake as a first. I just read it. It's not mine.
Can I add an amendment on that?
If you second it,
Okay.
yes, we can talk about
Okay,
that.
I will second.
Okay.
With an amendment suggestion that our EL programs, because they have aides and assistants, and you specifically identified general ed and special ed only, and I think it's important to do a full breadth of all aides and assistants. So.
Do you accept that? I accept, absolutely.
Okay, so we have a
Thanks for keeping us on
fantastic
track, sir.
amendment. We have a fantastic amendment by Trustee Hull. We have agreed to add EL aides to that, and also to make sure that it's clear that we're broadening to all aides and assistants. So thank you. We have we have an agreement between both our first and our second. Seeing no lights on.
I just want to make sure that Dr. Nicolette got anything she had to say.
Thank you. I definitely need that read again. Again, it seems a little breathy. Please read it again.
Sure. You got it. Okay, you got it. I move that the Board of Trustees directs the superintendent to prepare an analysis to include, but is not limited to, the compensation, hours allocated, benefits of all aides and assistants in special education, general education, and EL programs.
Thank you.
Okay. Seeing no lights on, and we've reread that, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, nay. Yeah, we'll pause for a moment.
Aye.
All right, one moment. I just want to make sure we get a clear voting record. So, Trustee Nicolette, there was a bit of a freeze. So I'm going to go ahead and just call for that vote again for procedural clarity. All those in favor, please say aye. 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 All those opposed, nay. All right, motion carries 7-0.
Madam President, I have a question, if I may. How many motions do we have so far?
I think this is our fourth, right? Is it our fourth? It's still fourth. It's our fourth because we had budget. We had like 6 or 7 last time, believe it or not, guys. This is not nearly as many as we had last year. And that's not to say that we can't request analyses at the next meeting, but here's what I will tell you. There reaches a point where we can't just keep coming up with new things. So it is completely okay in the next meeting to request additional analyses in addition to what we've had. But there has to be a point where we're done with what we've asked to see because we can't surprise. Well, okay, technically we could. We could take votes and we could do anything we want, but it would not be most productive for the success of the team if we're asking for brand new and different analyses as we get into April, May, things like that. And I believe we had 6 or 7 when we did this last year for the current budget year that we're in right now. So the 4 that I think we have is we have the budget, we have the aides, we have student teachers, and then we also have the end fund balance. Yeah. Okay.
I just have a quick question. This is not necessarily a request for an analysis. Oh, wait, sorry, Diane had her hand raised first. I can let her go.
That's okay. I do have a request. Go ahead, trustee.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nicolette. On page 30 of the presentation, it says initial budget meetings with departments have begun and reviewing everything and then also reviewing major contracts. I don't necessarily need a huge analysis. I'm just curious if we will be able to have access to any potential cost savings there with that. Like if, there's a program that we had been paying for and like CNI says, oh, we're not really using that, we don't need it anymore. Will we be able to see where those cost savings are happening? I'm just curious about that.
Thank you, Trustee Hall. We certainly have been looking at all of our contracts, all of our vendors. We continue to do that within the budget process, continue to be able to identify savings, knowing the backdrop of what we're tasked with here. And so I appreciate the comment and know that we are continuing with that analysis as well.
Great.
Yeah, and in that vein, I don't want to go back and go back to that motion, but I do want to just share with the team that something that's come up in my own visits with the educators, particularly in special education, is maybe allocating, based on minutes rather than student, which is an interesting idea because different students have different amounts. Trustee Nicolette, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I think my thinking is a little smaller. It could be the cold in my head, but so it's a little smaller and more focused on students. I would like an analysis on looking at decreasing the transportation walk zone for high school students. I think we wrongly assume that students are driving each other and they're driving their cars and those kinds of things. And I think that it has become a real burden for students, especially since I'm sure you notice as you're out and about with your school visits that not all areas have sidewalks, especially on some of these busy streets. And so I think it becomes very problematic, and it is a safety issue. And I think it directly relates to chronic absenteeism, which of course is relates to improved academic achievement. So I would like an analysis and it to be similar as it was for what we did for in middle school and high schoolers, but I would actually like the walk zone to be cut down to 2 miles. I know this is very impactful. Our bus drivers, our buses, do we have enough equipment? Do we have enough time to make this happen? And that's the analysis that I would like to look at. So if we need to have some discussion, I'm totally open to that, or I can make a motion, whatever it is, the pleasure of the board. Thank you.
I'm making some notes.
I did have a question.
Go ahead, Trustee
Okay,
Westlake, while I write some notes down.
Thank you, Smith. I was just wondering, are all the buses full capacity for high schools? Because there are some driving, but so maybe they're not full capacity. I'm just wondering if we could do like a hybrid thing where if they're, you know, out from the cutoff point, they could walk to the bus pickup, so they're not walking as far, but then we're not having to really add in more stops. Is that making sense? I don't know.
No, it is. And so it's something that you're bringing up is actually something I was writing down as a note, because some districts for the high school, because you know that it's tougher for elementary and middle, because although parents may drive their kids, they can't drive themselves. But some districts do have ways that they can opt out of their transportation, which would allow us to know, you know, we don't have that right now where families can opt out. So there could also be an analysis about ridership.
So that was
and,
one of
and
my
approaches.
That was one of my things, just a hybrid thing. If the buses aren't already to full capacity, to get the maximum bang for our buck. So that was a lot. The other thing I want to use Hug as an example. So we had a neighborhood high school basically, and the kids all around there were walking to the school. It was right there in the neighborhood. Then we moved it across McCarran and up on the hill, and now a lot of the kids, they're driving, but they don't have a license. And we're not offering driver's ed anymore. So I don't know if we could do an analysis on driver's ed or something, but that's, I know, I just want to add one thing. Principal McElhaney, he's having to tell kids, you know, if you drive, I know you don't have a license, I'm going to have your car towed because it's a safety issue. And so now we've hindered those kids getting to school. We moved the school out of their area, and we don't have a driver's ed to support getting these kids licensed. I'm kind of a, you know, the cat eating its tail, basically.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I view that as, you know, families also have to educate their kids on how to drive. But, okay, I want to go back to Dr. Nicolette, because I really like where you're going with this. Spoiler alert, I might be the second on it.
You helped me kind of reframe my thinking. So to that, unless somebody else has really something pivotal to add, I know my colleagues probably have some other motions. I'm just going to give it a shot. We've got a lot on our plate, and we've given a lot of work to district employees. So I want to be very careful, but I think this is important because it directly relates to our students. It's a direct relationship. So Trustee Diane Nicolette makes a motion to direct the superintendent to analyze strategies for reducing walk zone areas for high school students.
I'll be the, oh, I'm sorry.
Can I get a point of clarification of how that's tied to the budget?
Yeah, so if I could, I think that the So, okay, so there's not a second, so it'll die, but we're going to come right back to it. The analysis would be, like we did with the student teachers, like a fiscal and administrative analysis. For that, because there would be the fiscal impacts of reducing the walk zones, and there could also be administrative analyses for considering ridership for high schools, but we would have to spell out that we're directing the superintendent for like a fiscal and administrative analysis of this, which is where we started when we did this for elementary schools and middle schools. Does that help?
Not the administrative issues, because we have to do the fiscal issues since this is on budget. So we can't be directing the superintendent to look at new programs. What we can do is maybe some fiscal impacts to Trustee Nicolette's point related to the walk zones, but not what would administratively that look like.
Very good. Okay.
Got it. Thank you for that. So since we don't have a second, can I withdraw that and make a new motion?
Yes.
All right.
And then you will have a second.
Efficiency and efficacy. Okay, Sarah, I hope I heard you correctly. Trustee Diane Nicolette directs the superintendent to conduct a fiscal impact analysis for reducing walk zones for high school students.
All right.
Yep.
I will be the second for that one. All right. I see no lights on. Yep. Oh, Vice President Mayberry.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think it's obviously a good discussion, but I think from my perspective, it's, we've piled our team up with a lot of studies, and I'm not going to support the motion. I think it's really a solution looking for a problem. I don't really hear this as an issue when I visit my schools. I think it's important, but I'm gonna be voting no. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that, and thank you very much for the direction that we got from our deputy chief. Okay. All those in favor, please say aye. 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 All those opposed, nay. Nay. All right. Motion carries 6-0. All right. Oh my gosh, 6-1, 6-1, 6-1. I'm going back to a time when we did not have all 7 trustees. It goes back to 6-1. Thank you so much, colleagues. And I look forward to that conversation as well too, because who knows what will come of the fiscal analysis and the different ways we could go about it. All right, team. So I think that's a 5, which again, there's not a limit, but as has been very appropriately pointed out, this is all work. We still had like 6+ last time. Trustee Wesley, let's try to so I love the stories and I love the explanation of it, but let's just try to be like, here's the thing, here's why, let's talk about it.
Okay. All right. I kind of want to get the feel from everyone else, because this might just be harebrained, but here's the thing. Having elementary schools start at 7:30 and our middle school start at 9, and here's the why.
Oh, Trustee Westlake, I'm going to tell you right now that is not going to be a fiscal analysis. Like, that would be more of like a board.
Wouldn't it affect because I'm thinking the buses, we'd have to see how much buses would be and stuff.
I think you can do an analysis of fiscally what that would look like if you are changing school start times. But since that isn't currently an administrative issue, I worry a little bit. We're getting off topic here, and now we're expanding ideas.
It's on absenteeism. It goes to the heart of absenteeism, and that's one of our superintendent's goals is to attack. Can I just say the reason why I'm bringing this up, and then if it's not, it's not. Okay. I mean, I'm fine with that. Our elementary school children have way more energy than our middle schoolers. Our middle schoolers, in middle school, we have definitely a higher absenteeism. Parents are usually at home to be able to get their elementary school kids to the bus, or drop them off at school or drop them off at the bus if that's the case. But then when it comes to the middle schoolers, there's a lot of absenteeism. and it's because most of the parents have already gone to work, but this would definitely have to be looked at as far as the cost of what this would be for buses, because I know some buses do elementary and then they do high school and they share and all of that. So that's why I'm bringing it up. I'm thinking it could definitely attack absenteeism, and it might even save us money. I don't know.
So I understand the reasoning. I worry a bit that by using the budget issue to go and open up an issue that is not currently in practice, that we are going beyond the scope of the agenda item, because this is specific to budget, and things like changing start times would be something that we would want to notice, because that's obviously a real issue. So I would not I think that's going a bit beyond the scope of the current budget issue and the task to kind of identify things within the current budget.
All right. And thank you for that. Thank you so much for that guidance. We have a really good run of no open meeting law violations that for me carries all the way to my committee days that I'm holding tight to. All right, this has been a fantastic conversation. And guys, we're not done. Team, we are not done. We'll have more conversations. We will see what the superintendent brings in terms of his ideas. They've all been listening to our conversations too. That's part of the brilliance of how the process works. They have the opportunity to listen to us, and we see what they bring to us, which are outside of these analyses as well too. Okay, so that now brings us, so how this works for all of our colleagues, because it's a good reminder, these items are unique because we pass each of these individual analyses, but then we also have a blanket motion that wraps everything together in a bow to close us out. And that is the motion that you see in front of you. We do not need to go through all of the individual motions, but we do need a blanket motion that closes the conversation. We see that in front of us. The Board of Trustees provides direction to the superintendent to analyze and report back to the Board of Trustees the budget items specifically voted on and discussed for budget issues, items, and other changes to the district's fiscal year 2025-26 budget process.
So moved.
You want to do it? No. Okay, you sure?
No, before we got to that, I did have a thought, and I would just hold on.
So what we'll do is we'll let that motion die.
Yeah.
For lack of a second, and then we'll have this conversation now, and then we'll come right back to that.
All the good things that were being said about, going after the special education and trying to recruit and retain teachers and all those other good ideas. The only one that came that I was listening to you guys talk about and I was wondering more about, and it might be just, maybe you could inform me or you might have an idea for it, is, we talked about the state PERS board and the information and pension reform. I don't know how that ties into anything at all as far as that goes, as far as the budget process. Where's the information on how that's all allocated and how does it go? And I don't know. I just wanted to put that out there. That was kind of on my mind because I don't think you guys had mentioned something that we never really went after it and looked at it really in detail. I don't know if that's something that you guys can address. Thank you, Trustee Phoenix. I think that that's a great point, and I think that this is certainly topical as we are endeavoring on the entirety of this budget experience, and so we can certainly continue to bring information back around that as we are learning more, or if there are additional changes that we learn from.
Yeah, and the only reason why I brought that up was because when you were answering that question, you were kind of like, I'm not really sure how that works, so we just get our numbers, and that's just how it goes. I think that's what I heard earlier when you were presenting. So I just wanted to make sure that we're kind of narrowing it down so I have that information on how that all works, and that's all I'm really asking for.
All right. Okay, so I will bring it back here. Do you want to read it this time, Trustee Woodley? Or because I know I did it before. The only thing that I added is because the specific budget items voted on and discussed, and other changes, because the way that they motions, they're kind of a baseline, but then we we might not have asked for any analyses. That's what this motion is based on. So we always have like a minor inclusion to report back to the Board of Trustees, the specific budget issues, items, or other changes as voted on and discussed, to the district's fiscal year. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. So I move the Board of Trustees provides direction to the superintendent to analyze and report back to the Board of Trustees specific budget items, issues that were discussed today to the district's fiscal year 2025-2026 budget process.
I'll second that.
All right, we have a motion by Clerk Woodley. We have a second by Vice President Mayberry. I see no hands on, but I do want to make sure that we formally welcome Dr. Nicolette. If there is any discussion, okay? No, seeing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, nay. All right, motion carries 7-0. I got the 7 right. All right, great work, colleagues, and thank you so much. You guys, I got to tell you, these are complex and challenging topics, and yet you just did it so pleasantly. So thank you for that. And that closes item 2.01 and brings us now to section 3, our closing items. And that brings us most specifically to item 3.01, our closing public comment.
Kaylin Evans.
Welcome, President Evans.
Okay. Hi, thank you for the record. My name is Kaylin Evans, President of the Washoe Education Association. I typically try to come up here and be as positive and constructive as possible. I feel like we have really proven ourselves to be a true partner with this district. We recently received communications from the handling negotiations for our district regarding our advocacy efforts, threatening to file a claim with the EMRB, arguing that publicly advocating for mentorship program expansion is an unfair labor practice. This approach is deeply concerning as it undermines collaboration and suggests a tactic aimed at discouraging educators from waiting for programs that directly benefit students. It also implies a nefarious intent on our part, as if our efforts to support students and strengthen public education are something to be challenged rather than embraced. If the argument is that public discussion on any issue that could be bargained over is inappropriate, then educators should not be allowed to speak on wages, working conditions, or any student supports. That's not how democracy or public education works. The WEA has always been open about the issues we advocate for. Our email to the Board of Trustees and the superintendent was public record. We shared it on our social medias because we believe this conversation should be open. We are simply advocating for what we feel is best for our schools, educators, and students. That's why this letter is so concerning. It suggests that speaking up about important programs is off limits. To be clear, this sets a bad tone for negotiations ahead. We have not yet started negotiations and have been eagerly advocating with the district to begin that process. The best outcomes for students and staff come from open and honest collaboration. To be clear, advocating for improvements in our schools is not the same as negotiating a contract. We have not even started negotiations. Through every challenge, though, the WA has remained a good faith and collaborative partner, dedicating significant time, energy, and resources into elevating the entire school district. We have consistently worked to create meaningful improvements for educators and students, and that will not change. Regardless of tactics used during negotiations, we will continue to be transparent, collaborative, and lead with integrity in everything we do. And we know that this board and our superintendent also share in that ideal. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody is aware as we move forward, and we appreciate truly all of your guys' dedication to this district. It's really encouraging listening to these. I had to step out, but I listened to everything, and thank you so much for your passion. It does not go unnoticed by the community. Thank you.
Thank you, President Evans.
That's all I have.
All right. That closes item 3.01 and brings us now to item 3.02, adjourning the meeting at 12:48 p.m. Thank you so much.